Bridger Mountains, Montana Territory, November 1876. The wind came down from the peaks like a blade, cutting through coats and bones, warning every soul in the valley that winter was ready to claim its due. Snow had not yet sealed the ground, but the cold already ruled the nights. In the middle of that rush stood Jacob Reinhardt, doing something that made his neighbors stop, stare, and laugh. Jacob was stacking stone between two log walls. He worked alone most days, his breath white in the air, his hands red and rough as he lifted river stone from a growing pile. An outer wall of full logs already stood, tight and clean. 18 inches inside it, Jacob raised a second wall of smaller logs. Between the two, instead of empty space, he packed stone, heavy stone, cold stone, stone that did not belong in a cabin wall, at least not according to anyone who had lived in these mountains before. "Waste of good timber," muttered Samuel Creek as he passed by, pulling his coat tighter. Samuel's family had built cabins in these mountains for 2 generations. They knew cold. They knew what worked. "Double the work for half the cents," added William Thorpe, the settlement's most respected builder. And Thorpe had raised cabins across Montana and Wyoming. His hands had shaped homes that still stood after decades of storms. If anyone understood winter, it was him. Jacob heard them. He said nothing. He had arrived from Germany only a year earlier. His first winter in Montana had nearly killed him. He had lived in a standard, single-wall log cabin, built the way everyone built them. When the fire died, the warmth vanished with it. By morning, ice formed on the inside of the walls. Sleep came in short, shaking hours. Survival felt like a daily gamble. Jacob had learned something that winter, something the others had accepted as fate. This time, he was not gambling. By early November, his cabin looked wrong, thick, heavy, almost like a small fort. The windows were smaller than usual, cut narrow to protect the wall's strength. The foundation went deep, stacked fieldstone reaching 4 feet down to bedrock. Some men joked the cabin would sink into the earth under its own weight. "You're wasting stone that could build a good fireplace," Samuel Creek told him one morning as Jacob fitted another layer tight against the logs. "That rock won't burn. It won't keep you warm." "Double walls trap moisture," Thorpe warned. "You'll have rot by spring. I've seen clever ideas fail. Mountains don't reward clever, they reward proven." Jacob nodded once and kept working. He chose each stone carefully, dense granite from the riverbed, sandstone from the southern ridge. He set them close, minimizing air gaps, forming a solid core that ran from the foundation up to 7 feet high. Every layer was tight, deliberate, planned. The space between the walls was no accident, 18 inches exactly. By mid-November, the laughter grew louder. "Man's building a castle to freeze in," Thomas Brickner joked as he passed with a wagon of hay. "Jacob the fool!" Jacob the foreigner who doesn't understand American winters. Jacob stacked more stone. What the others did not understand was that Jacob was not building a cabin to heat quickly. He was building a cabin to remember heat. Standard cabins lost warmth as fast as they gained it. Fire burned, air warmed, fire died, cold returned. The logs themselves held little heat. Pine and spruce warmed quickly, but cooled just as fast. The cold outside pressed in from every surface, every breath of wind stealing comfort away. Jacob had learned this long before Montana, watching thick-walled buildings in Europe hold warmth long after fires burned low. Stone absorbed heat slowly, but once warm it gave that heat back just as slowly, not minutes, hours. The stone in his walls weighed thousands of pounds. It would take time to warm, yes, days, not hours. But once charged, it would become a quiet source of steady warmth through the longest nights. His neighbors saw only smoke. For 3 days straight, Jacob's chimney poured it into the sky. He fed the fire morning, noon, and night. He split more wood. He stacked more beside the door. "He'll burn through his winter supply by Christmas," Brickner said on the 3rd day. Jacob said nothing. He knew the fire was not for comfort yet. It was for preparation. December came hard and fast. Snow buried the valley. The wind howled without mercy. By mid-month, the cold tightened its grip, and cabins across the settlement began to show their weakness. Samuel Creek's cabin, built the right way by every known rule, lost its warmth 2 hours after the fire died. By dawn, ice traced the inside of his windows. The floor bit through boots. This was normal. This was frontier life. Jacob's cabin stood quiet and dark at night, its walls thick and still. On December 18th, the temperature fell to 14 degrees by dawn. By noon, it dropped to 8. By sunset, it slipped below 0, and the wind rose like an angry spirit sweeping down from the peaks. 3 days later, the real cold arrived. Morning temperatures sank to 22 below 0. The air burned lungs. Water froze inside buckets within an hour. Livestock stiffened in their stalls. Fear spread faster than firewood vanished. Families burned through wood at a desperate pace. Samuel Creek fed his stove through the night, taking turns with his wife to keep the flames alive. Even so, the floor temperature fell below freezing before dawn. His youngest daughter woke crying, her toes white and numb despite layers of wool. William Thorpe fared better, but only slightly. His larger firebox devoured wood. His carefully built cabin held warmth near the ceiling, useless where people slept. And Jacob Reinhardt waited. Inside his cabin, the stone walls had finally reached their purpose. The heat from weeks of fire had soaked deep into the rock. The walls no longer felt cold. They felt alive, quietly breathing warmth back into the room. On the night of December 23rd, while the valley froze under a sky sharp with stars, Jacob let his fire die. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the walls held steady. The mountains were about to deliver their verdict. The night of December 23rd, 1876, pressed down on the Bridger Valley like a heavy hand. The wind did not ease after sunset. It grew sharper, cutting through trees and across open ground, carrying snow that stung exposed skin. Inside most cabins, fear settled in with the cold. Fires burned low and fast. Wood piles shrank by the hour. Samuel Creek sat on a stool beside his stove, feeding it again and again. The heat barely reached the far wall. Frost crept along the floorboards. His wife wrapped blankets tighter around their children. The youngest whimpered in her sleep, her feet still aching from the night before. William Thorpe paced his cabin, measuring air with his hands. Warm near the ceiling, cold at the floor. He had built this place himself, thicker chinking than most. A larger firebox than any in the valley. Still, the cold pushed back. He knew the sound of a fire that was losing a fight. Across the settlement, Jacob Reinhardt sat at his small table, eating supper in calm silence. The fire in his stove had burned down to embers hours earlier. He wore no coat, only a wool shirt and trousers. The air inside his cabin was steady, comfortable, almost gentle. The stone walls around him were warm to the touch. They did not rush heat into the air. They released it slowly, evenly, like a held breath finally let go. The cold outside pressed against the outer log wall, but it could not reach the stone core. The inner wall stayed warm, the air between walls still and quiet. Jacob slept that night without waking. Before dawn, the temperature outside dropped even further. The wind howled through the valley, shaking roofs and rattling shutters. In Samuel Creek's cabin, the fire burned low despite constant tending. When morning came, the floor near the door measured below freezing. Ice clung to the water bucket. Jacob woke to a cool room, but not a cold one. The air was still above 50 degrees. The stone walls had cooled only slightly through the long night. He lit his fire again, not in panic, not in desperation, but calmly, as part of a routine. By mid-morning, word began to move through the settlement. It started with a look. Samuel Creek stepped outside to fetch more wood and saw smoke rising from Jacob's chimney, thin and steady. Not the frantic pouring smoke of a fire being forced to fight cold, but a calm line drifting upward. Creek frowned. He crossed the frozen ground and knocked on Jacob's door. When it opened, a wave of warmth rolled out. Creek stepped back without meaning to. His breath caught. Lord above, he said softly. Jacob stepped aside and invited him in. Creek stood near the door, stunned. The air did not bite. The floor did not freeze his boots. The walls felt warm under his hand. Not hot, warm. "How long your fire been burning?" Creek asked. "Since sunrise," Jacob answered. "Before that, it was out since late evening." Creek stared at the stove, then at the walls. He said nothing for a long moment. By noon, others came. Men stepped inside, one by one, their faces changing the moment the door closed behind them. Some laughed in disbelief. Others stayed quiet, touching the walls, watching the thermometer Jacob had nailed near the table. William Thorpe arrived last. He came with doubt in his eyes and a thermometer in his hand. He measured the air near the floor, then near the ceiling. The numbers were close, too close. He waited. Hours passed. Jacob did not feed the fire. The temperature inside dropped slowly, almost politely. Not a sudden fall, not a rush toward cold, just a gentle easing. Thorpe measured again and again. The stone walls remained warm to the hand. He stepped outside and pressed the thermometer against the outer wall. The cold bit back hard. The difference was shocking. Thorpe stood silent for a long time. That night, the cold held. Fires burned everywhere. Wood vanished fast. But something had changed. Hope had entered the valley, carried not by words, but by proof. On December 27th, Thorpe returned alone. He asked Jacob questions, careful ones, about the stone, the spacing, the foundation. Jacob answered each one plainly. No boasting, no pride, only explanation. "The stone holds what the fire gives," Jacob said. "The walls slow the escape. You do not fight the cold hour by hour. You prepare for it." Thorpe nodded slowly. "I told you this would rot," he said. "I told you it would fail." Jacob smiled, small and kind. "You told me what you knew," he said. By New Year's Day, the laughter was gone. Men spoke of stone now, of double walls, of weight and patience, of building for winters that did not forgive mistakes. The cold stayed through January, fierce and unforgiving. Families who could afford it bought wood at high prices. Others rationed heat, sleeping in shifts, feeding fires through the night. Jacob burned less wood than anyone. His cabin cooled slowly. Even when the fire died, the walls held steady. No ice on the windows, no frozen floors, no fear waking him before dawn. Samuel Creek's daughter healed, but the memory of that cold stayed with him. He stood in Jacob's cabin more than once, staring at the walls as if they held a secret language. By the end of January, men stopped calling the design crazy. They called it Reinhardt's Wall. And before winter released its grip, the valley understood that one stubborn mountain man had changed how they would survive the cold forever. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. Winter finally loosened its grip in late February of 1877. The wind softened. The sun lingered longer over the Bridger Mountains. Snow still covered the valley, but the worst had passed. Cabins stood battered and blackened by smoke, wood piles reduced to thin stacks of hope. People emerged from survival mode carrying the weight of what they had endured. Jacob Reinhardt stepped outside his cabin one quiet morning and looked across the settlement. He had lived through the cold without fear, without injury, without burning himself into exhaustion. The stone walls behind him still felt warm, even as the fire rested low. His idea had done what it was meant to do. The others had paid a price to learn. Samuel Creek counted what remained of his firewood and shook his head. He had burned nearly 3 times what he planned. His daughter's frostbitten toes healed, but the memory of her crying in the night never left him. He knew now that the suffering had not been unavoidable. William Thorpe carried a different burden, pride. He had been wrong. Worse, he had been confidently wrong. His reputation was built on knowledge passed down and proven by time. Yet here stood a cabin that broke those rules and stood stronger because of it. To his credit, Thorpe did not hide. In early March, he walked to Jacob's cabin with paper, charcoal, and questions. He measured the wall thickness. He noted the stone types. He recorded the spacing between logs. He asked about airflow, moisture, and foundation depth. Jacob answered everything. He explained how the stone had to be continuous from ground to chest height, how the walls needed to be sealed tight to stop drafts, how river stone worked better than fractured quarry rock, how the outer wall blocked the cold and the inner wall returned warmth back into the room. Thorpe listened. By spring, word spread beyond the valley. Men rode in from nearby settlements to see the cabin for themselves. They touched the walls. They stood quietly inside. They asked the same questions Thorpe had asked. Jacob never charged a cent. He drew diagrams in the dirt. He spoke simply. That summer, hammers rang across the Bridger Valley. 9 new cabins rose with double walls and stone cores. Thorpe himself led several builds, improving the method without changing its heart. He placed denser stone low, lighter stone higher. He adjusted airflow to control how heat moved through the room. He called it refinement. He always credited Jacob. The next winter came early, but it did not bring fear. The new cabins held steady. Fires burned slower. Families slept through the night. Children woke warm. The valley no longer smelled of panic smoke before dawn. By 1880, dozens of cabins across Montana and nearby territories used the same design. Some called them Reinhardt walls. Others called them German heat walls. Names mattered less than results. Jacob Reinhardt lived the rest of his life in the cabin he built in 1876. He grew old there. He watched winters come and go without ever fearing them again. When he died in 1903, the walls still stood firm, still holding warmth the way they always had. Time moved on. Cheap lumber arrived. New insulation promised faster builds and quicker heat. Stone walls fell out of favor. The old methods were called slow, heavy, outdated. The knowledge faded not because it failed, but because it demanded patience. Yet the truth never changed. Fighting cold was never about bigger fires. It was about holding what you already had, slowing loss, letting warmth work for you while you slept. Jacob Reinhardt understood that when others did not, he trusted observation over tradition. He trusted patience over panic. And because of that, people lived who might not have otherwise. The mountains remembered. And every stone set into those walls still carries the quiet lesson that stubborn ideas sometimes save lives.